I'm Eric Marcus. I make Making Gay History.
And I'm Sara Burningham, and I help Eric Marcus make Making Gay History.
We make it together. So you were just listening to a woman named Edith Ide, AKA Lisa Ben. Does anyone play word games? Lisa Ben spells a familiar word, lesbian. She actually had chosen the pen name I'm a Spinster, but her colleagues at The Ladder, which was an early lesbian publication, first published in the 1950s, they didn't think it was very funny. So she chose Lisa Ben instead. Lisa sang songs in the 1950s and 60s in the gay clubs, and we'll explain a little bit more about her in a moment. But she's just one of about 100 or so voices that I recorded when I was working on a book which was then called Making History. I traveled the country interviewing people who were involved in some aspect of the movement, from Burbank, California, which is where I interviewed Edith Ide, to a few blocks north of where I now live in Chelsea with Vito Russo. That book was published in 1992. It was just re-released this week in an ebook by HarperCollins, which is something I've been working for years. So happily you can read it, but you don't have to read it because you can just listen to it with Making Gay History.
Yeah, and so Eric did these interviews and then stacked the tapes very carefully, catalogued them meticulously.
What Sarah's being very kind about is that I am so thoroughly OCD. When I had the New York Public Library come to take all of my tapes, I just assumed everybody did that.
No, not everybody does that.
It was a 6-foot-high stack of tapes in trays.
And for every tape, for every person that Eric interviewed, there's these comprehensive field notes. What the sun was shining that day, the rain was pouring, the living room was musty, the kitchen table had vodka on it. All these really incredible details that that he stored alongside these tapes. So the tapes went off to the New York Public Library as you donated them to the archive there.
In 2008.
Yeah.
I originally recorded the interviews from 1988 through 1991.
And then why did you go back to those tapes, Eric?
I got fired. I got fired from my job at an organization focused on the prevention of suicide, and thought, well, what am I going to do next? I was 57. People don't like to hire 57-year-olds. I called the New York Public Library to see what the status was of my tapes, which they had agreed to digitize as part of the transfer of my material to them, and the tapes had just been digitized. So I thought, I've got 300 hours of audio, what am I going to do with it? So I started having conversations with lots of people about what I might do, which led to an educational project. So I asked my neighbor, Sara Burningham, who lives directly across the street from me, and I knew Sara. Sara had been an audio producer, and I said, can you cut tape?
And I said, sure. What is it, though? Because I knew that Eric had written this book, but listen, all tape isn't created equal. If you're recording these interviews that just so you can transcribe them and sort of turn them into a book, it's not necessarily going to be anything that a person would want to sit down and listen to. But I had faith in Eric, even with even with some of my concerns, and so I said, sure, let's take a look at it. And then I listened to the very first tape, and well, you'll hopefully share the experience in a minute, that it just blew my socks off.
These people just come to life. I don't know why I was working at CBS News at the time, and I asked one of my colleagues who had created Morning Edition and Weekend Edition on NPR, I said, what do your colleagues use to record interviews? And he referred me to one of his colleagues, and that's the equipment I bought. And I still thank my 30-year-old self all these years later for recording these interviews with broadcast quality equipment, because I couldn't have used them for the purpose of a podcast, and podcasts, of course, didn't exist then, unless they'd been recorded with broadcast quality equipment.
There's a bigger sort of moral to this story, which is future-proofing your archive as much as you can, right?
Yes.
But and the thing that was incredible about it is when you hear these voices and the ability to deliver them to new audiences, to new ears as a podcast, means that people who would otherwise have been forgotten it literally, it is. It's like bringing people back to life in a strange way.
I like to think the first time around I told everyone's stories in print. And it wasn't, and I'm not a religious person or even spiritual. I'm a National Geographic reader. And I like to think, though, that these people wanted to tell their stories in their own voices. And that's what led us to this project. Most of the people who were featured in Making Gay History died years ago. Edith actually only died just a few years ago. When she died, there was no obit anywhere.
Well, this was the thing, when we came to make an episode about Edith, Eric tried to reach out to her.
Yeah, and I looked on her Wikipedia file, said that she was still alive. It turns out she was not. She had died just a short time before, at age 95. So you heard her singing, and Edith wrote and sang popular songs with her own lyrics and some of her own music as well in the gay clubs in the 1950s and 60s, because she didn't like the entertainment that she saw in the clubs. Much of it was derogatory. The entertainers often played to the straight people who would be allowed into the girls' clubs in the evenings. So they would play to watch the girls dance. I mean, it sounds it sounds creepy.
She said it was creepy.
It was creepy. But the entertainers played to the straight people, and she didn't like the derogatory jokes that they told. So she decided, I will write my own songs, and I will write my own music, and I'll sing them in the clubs. And she did. But she's better known for having published the first, what we would call a zine for lesbians in 1947. If you had a job, if you were working at RKO Radio Pictures in 1947 as a secretary, and your boss said, you're not always going to be busy, but I want you to look busy, I don't want you to knit, I don't want you to read, I want you to do something, what would you do? And Edith decided she would write a newsletter, a magazine she called it, for lesbians, called Vice Versa. The tagline was America's Gayest Magazine. And in it, she shared her own thoughts for the future. There's one particular essay, which she'll tell you about. We'll play a bit of tape, where she imagined the world in which we live today. And in 1947, there was no reason to believe that LGBTQ people would even have identities like LGBTQ, let alone that we would have equal rights. So here's a bit of, oops, there is Edith Ide. And here's a clip from her interview.
It was just some writing that I wanted to do to get it off my chest, and I was a very lonely person, and I could sort of fantasize this way by writing the magazine, you see. And then, I'd write at the end the whatchamacallem, and that was just ideas that happened off the top of my head that I would write about and say, wouldn't it be wonderful if, not fantasize exactly, but imagine about how things might be in the future with us.
What were some of the things you imagined?
Well, I imagined that perhaps we would have a lot of magazines and that perhaps even movies might be made about us. I would hope that someday we would not be looked down on with so much disdain.
Well, I think this may be where this is the column, this is the article, Here to Stay. September 1947, Volume 1, Number 4. Whether the unsympathetic majority approves or not, it looks as though the third sex is here to stay. With the advancement of psychiatry and related subjects, the world is becoming more and more aware that there are those in our midst who feel no attraction for the opposite sex. Homosexuality is becoming less and less a taboo subject, and although still considered by the general public as contemptible or treated with derision, I venture to predict that there will be a time in the future when gay folk will be accepted as part of regular society. That's pretty bold stuff.
Well, I guess it is. I never thought of it as being bold at the time. I was just, as I say, I was just sort of fantasizing. But it all has come to pass.
The amazing thing is she wrote that magazine on her office typewriter, typed through twice using 5 sheets of carbon paper each time, and then distributed it to her friends who passed it on to their friends and on to their friends. And you can actually see a copy of the original Vice Versa, all of the issues, on our website if you go to the Edith Ide episode. It's been scanned, and we have a link to it. So you can see all of the episodes she wrote.
And so, yeah, so there was Edith typing onto carbon paper, and And in fact, when you then came to interview her those 30 years later, after she wrote that column, finding her wasn't that straightforward, was it?
No, it took 26 phone calls to find her because I couldn't just do a Google search. So I called people and wrote to people to see where she was, and it took 26 phone calls. And on the 26th call, she picked up her phone and said, hello. In later years, I stayed in touch with Edith, actually, especially right after I interviewed her. I would call occasionally, and whenever she picked the phone up, she said, hello, Eric. There was no phone ID then. And I said one time, how do you know it's me? She said, well, nobody else calls. So it's something that I found with many of the people I interviewed, that they were very, very isolated. They grew up in a very isolated world and lived in an isolated world, in part because of their fear of even sharing with anyone who they were and what their identities were. So let's go on to Wendell Sayers. We don't have a photo of Wendell. I didn't take pictures of anybody I interviewed. It was a long time ago. And I also felt it would be a little intrusive to ask. And in those days, people didn't take pictures in the same way that we do now.
Well, and both Wendell and Edith had used pseudonyms as well. It wasn't the case.
Yes, they didn't use their real names in my book. They asked me to use their pseudonyms. Wendell Sayers was Paul Phillips in the book. He was in his mid-80s when I interviewed him, and he was afraid that some of his relatives in Kansas might find out that he was gay. So we like to say that these stories, the story of the movement, the LGBTQ civil rights movement, are told in small stories and in big stories. Big stories with people like Sylvia Rivera, small stories like Wendell Sayers. People like Wendell contributed generally in very small ways to the movement, but in those days, in the 1950s, to be out at all, to go to a meeting, was a huge leap of faith, because you could lose your job, lose your family, lose your children, and lose your home. So Wendell didn't change the world, but his story is really an important part of the narrative. In 1920, he was sent to the Mayo Clinic by his father, who thought that he might be a homosexual. They lived in western Kansas, and Wendell's mother drove him from western Kansas to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And he said along the way, they slept in a tent. They brought a tent with them, and they bought food at the side of the road and ate at the side of the road. And I said, why? Stupid me. Because they were black. And most places would not, actually no one would rent a room to them. And they couldn't eat in restaurants. So this is a clip from Wendell on his way. He's talking about coming back from the Mayo Clinic after he's been diagnosed as a homosexual and his fears about talking to his father.
So we went back home and reported to Dad. I might say this, that I was an adopted child. Mm-hmm. And I often used to wonder as a kid, what will he do when he finds it out, see? Will he put me out or kick me out, or will he accept me? My dad was very understanding. I say understanding, I don't think he actually understood, but he was willing to accept, I should say. Mm-hmm. So he finally told me, he says, well, since I don't know what to do about it, find you a friend that you can trust and bring him home. He says, I don't want you playing around on the streets or out on the country roads, because you never know who's going to step up behind you or step up on you. Bring him home. What you do in your room is your business, because he didn't want me out on the street.
What Wendell's story tells us is the threat that psychiatry posed to gay people in those days, that you could be diagnosed and institutionalized. And there were all kinds of horrible treatments used to, put this in quotes, cure gay people of their sexuality. And we all know that that's not possible, but in those days that people didn't know that. But it's also the intersection of sexuality, race, and segregation. And Wendell was also adopted. So there were enormous fears that he came home with. But he overcame a lot. He wound up becoming the first black attorney to work for the Attorney General of Colorado, and he worked in Denver. You won't read that in the book because he asked me not to indicate even where he had worked, or I should say which state he worked in. Wendell's story has always stayed with me because of what he said to me on the step of his house as I was leaving. He's this very powerful man, even in his mid-80s, crisp white shirt, string tie, a thin tie, gray pressed slacks, black shoes, polished shoes. And he said, "Do you think it's too late for me to meet someone?" And he said, "Not for sex." He said, it's too late for that. He said, "But for companionship." And I said, knowing that I was lying, that it was never too late. But I knew from what he'd already told me about his life that the odds of him meeting anybody were almost none, because even in his church, he didn't let people know he was gay. He had two friends in his church who knew, but they both died of AIDS. So he was alone again. So he spent the rest of his life alone.
And that's with the podcast, with the tapes, is the impact of those stories when you hear them, when you hear that person's voice, and the ability to for them to whisper in your ear their experience is just so unique, and it tells you so much more than dates and times. Eric could give a rundown of the history of the DSM and talk about the history of conversion therapy and so on, but
it's not nearly as interesting as the stories themselves, and it's one of the reasons I was a little reluctant when I was called by an editor, Harper and Row, which became HarperCollins, commissioning this book, because he said he wanted me to write an oral history book, and history was incredibly boring, at least as I had been taught it by Mr. Fetterbush at Russell Sage Junior High School in Queens, who sat behind his desk and read from our school textbook about American history for 45 minutes straight, and we took notes. And every once in a while, he'd drop a bit. He would say that he was at the Battle of the Bulge during World War II. And that was it. But that was most interesting to all of us, as we wanted to know what happened. He wouldn't talk about that. So I thought history was boring until I started interviewing people and hearing their stories.
And that history is in the small moments, and in that story of Wendell and his mother and sleeping in a tent by the side of the road as he is driven to the Mayo Clinic to be diagnosed. And then also in bigger moments and by sometimes bigger personalities as well.
Yes. How many of you have ever heard of Sylvia Rivera? How many of you have ever heard Sylvia Rivera's voice? I had forgotten what Sylvia sounded like. Sylvia is a trans icon, and in this clip she describes the most famous event in U.S. LGBT history, at least famous for us in New York, the Stonewall Uprising. So have a listen to Sylvia.
To be there, it's just like, oh, it was so beautiful. I just like, it's like.
Was it exciting?
Oh, it was so exciting. It was like, ow, we're doing it. We're doing it. We're fucking their nerves.
The thing that
Cops were, they just panicked. Inspector Pine really panicked. Mm-hmm. He really did. Mm-hmm. Plus, he had no backup. Mm-hmm. He knew. He did not expect any of the retaliation that the gay community gave him at that point.
Do you think all this was in part because people were so angry for so long?
People were very angry for so long. I mean, how long can you live in a closet?
It's easy to forget how young the street kids were at the Stonewall Uprising. That picture you're seeing is Sylvia in 1970, taken by one of the icons of the movement, a woman named Kay Tobin Lahusen, whose photos will be featured at the New York Public Library for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. Sylvia was 17 at the time of the riots. They were kids, almost all kids. And Sylvia was living on the street from the age of 11. There was no place in the world for gender nonconforming people like Sylvia in the 1960s.
And that anger that she expressed is something that, so I listened through to these tapes and hundreds of hours of interviews, is this theme that comes back over and over, is the moment of radicalization, the moment at which enough is enough, and the anger sparks action.
So often I said to people, you were so courageous, and no one ever said I was courageous. They all said either I was angry or I was looking for a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So it's either about anger or love. That's what has propelled the movement. And that was it. Mm-hmm. But radicalization was a key thing. So many people had terrible things done to them. One of those people who had terrible things done to them was Joyce Hunter. Joyce had every reason to be angry. She had a horrific childhood, almost Dickensian. She was born, she was in those days we would call it an out-of-wedlock child. Her mother was Orthodox Jewish, 16 years old, and her father was African American, and one of many children, and was sent off to an orphanage.
One of 8, grew up in an orphanage, and then was returned to the care of her parents, which was an abusive home.
Yeah, when she was in her teens.
When she was 14 in the Bronx, taken away from the only family she knew, in a sense, which were the other kids in the orphanage.
And she went on to do extraordinary things, but I'll tell you about that after we play this clip of Joyce talking about what she wished for.
One of the things that the movement did for me, it gave me a vehicle to express my anger.
What were you angry about?
Everything. That I had been denied my life, that I had no adolescence. My childhood was robbed. I always say that when I come back in the next life, I want to come out at 2, and I want to be able to enjoy being who I am.
She has had an extraordinary life. She is still alive. She's 79 years old, and
she was with us with Eric on stage at the Bell House in Brooklyn on Saturday night for the
standing room only audience for the big queer Podfest, and she was greeted like a rock star. Joyce went on to become, she was one of the first staff people at what has become HMI, earlier known as the Hedrick Martin Institute, and before that it was known as the Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth.
She was co-organizer of the 1979 March on Washington.
She was a co-founder of the Harvey Milk High School.
She also is a PhD research scientist in AIDS and HIV prevention.
And she was a New York City Human Rights Commissioner.
Human Rights Commissioner.
Who has spoken before the UN on multiple occasions.
Yeah, she was part of the working group that set up the organization that is now Outright International.
Yep.
You actually can't keep track of all Joyce's achievements.
And she's just totally understated. And
but the night that changed it all for her was in Washington Square. Was actually during the day, Washington Square Park, when she was beaten up.
She was beaten up, so badly beaten, she spent a month in the hospital. And she couldn't continue to do the work she was doing after that because she couldn't stand for long hours and she had been a sous chef. So the occupational therapy folks sent her off for evaluation and they said, you should go to college, to which she said, I don't have a high school degree. So she got her GED, she got her bachelor's degree, she got her master's degree, she got her PhD. As she said to me when I interviewed her, they thought they were going to put me 6 feet underground, and what they did is they sent an activist on her way. And they did, and she's fierce. You don't mess with Joyce. At the time of Stonewall, she was married and had 2 children, so she also had to extricate herself from a marriage, because after she tried to kill herself when she was in her teens, the psychiatrist who she met with at the psychiatric hospital where she spent a year said, if you get married and have children, you'll get over your feelings. You can imagine how successful that was. She got married, she had children, she did not get over her feelings for women. And she's now, she's a mother, grandmother, and a great-grandmother. And you can hear her whole story on at Making Gay History. It's one of my favorites, among favorites. So, Perry Watkins. Perry's problem wasn't coming out. Perry was out. He was out from the time he was a high school student. I won't tell you exactly how everyone knew he was out, but
Listen to the episode.
listen to the episode. Yes, this is for a general audience. The problem with Perry was that the military didn't want to know that he was gay, even though they knew he was gay. I'll play you the clip and then I'll explain a little more about Perry.
I was not trying to go into the military. That's why I told them I was. That's why I find it absolutely ludicrous that the Army is in court saying, we don't want this man. Well, why the hell did you take me?
Right.
And why am I the one that is being accused of being at fault? It is amazing. But no, I checked the block, yes. They sent me into a psychiatrist who said to me, why did you check this box, yes? And I went, because you asked me to fill the form out honestly. Well, do you object to going in the military? No. I didn't want to go in the military. Who did?
Right.
But I certainly had no objection to serving my country.
And you were raised to be honest.
Extremely so. Why I really checked the box was because I thought, if I go into the military, I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm gay. I know myself well enough to know that. So when I get thrown out, Mom will be angry if I lie. That was why I checked the box. When I get put out of the military, Mom will be more angry with me for lying than why didn't I just tell the damn truth to begin with?
Perry served for 15 years before he was thrown out. And all along the way, they knew that he was gay. What prompted them to throw him out was that they kept revoking his security clearance every time he was transferred. And the fourth time, he had it. And so he sued. And then they threw him out because he was gay, even though they knew he was gay. He even performed overseas in his alter ego character, Simone, in drag. When Perry talked with me about this, he said that, as I asked him, why did they take you, even though you checked off the box that you were gay? And he said that he'd like to see a study of all the black men who checked off homosexual and were sent to Vietnam, and all the white men who checked off homosexual and were not sent to Vietnam. And his theory was that they just figured that a gay black man would come back in a body bag. As subsequent studies have shown, black men were more likely to be sent into combat than white men. We don't have statistics on that, and I'm hoping a graduate student who listens to this episode will research it.
Yeah.
So Perry survived the military, and after a 9-year court battle, he was the first gay person to be reinstated in the military. But he died of AIDS in 1996, just 3 years after he served as the Grand Marshal in the New York City Pride March. I'm guessing that no one in this room has ever heard of Perry Watkins. Well, let's see a show. How many people have ever heard of Perry Watkins? Yeah. One of the joys for us is bringing these stories to life for people who should be remembered, whose stories are important and would have been forgotten otherwise. When I talked to Perry, I asked him about being a trailblazer, and he said he did not choose to be a trailblazer, but he felt compelled to be one because of what was done to him.
Yeah, he said he had no choice but to stand up and fight, just because he said simply it was the right thing to do. Yeah. But sometimes standing up and fighting sort of comes in quite a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's sitting down and writing.
Yes, and this is Dear Abby. Some of you may know who she is, a lot of you may not. She was, is there an equivalent today of Dear Abby? There isn't. This was a time when people read newspapers, and Dear Abby was the most famous columnist in the world, except for her twin sister, Ann Landers, who was also the most famous advice giver in the world. When I was a kid, we would get the papers on Sunday when my grandparents came to visit, and my grandmother always read Dear Abby and Ann Landers, and people wrote to them about all kinds of things. When Dear Abby started writing about gay people in the 1960s, it was before gay people were really able to stand up and speak for themselves. And she was a voice of authority. She was the first national figure, respected figure, to come out in support of gay people. She took a stand and she changed hearts and minds. And I'm going to play a little bit of a clip from her about the reaction she got when she wrote things in the paper about gay people.
There was a column that you wrote. This is the woman who complained about the new neighbors next door, a strange man in the couple.
Well, the letter was, this is a nice neighborhood, and we're very disgusted with these types. what could we do to improve the neighborhood? And my answer was, you could move. The gays thought it was hilarious. But other than just being amusing, entertaining, there was a good message there.
Which was?
Which was they have a right to be. If you don't like it, you could move. Because they have as much the right to be them as you have to be yourself.
Mm-hmm. How much of an impact do you think you've had as one person on this issue?
I think I was I would say I was one of the first person on a national level that wasn't gay. I wasn't defending myself. I was defending everyone's right to be themselves, gay, straight, no matter.
And that was in the beginning of the 1950s.
It took, people tell me it took a lot of guts, but I was happy to have a platform such as I had.
I just want you to picture for a moment what it was like to interview Abby. I grew up in a time when Abby was as famous as Ellen DeGeneres. And I pulled up to her small mansion, her mansion in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, and double height doors, French provincial, or French Second Empire crossed with God knows what Hollywood. And she opened this, she answered the door, and she was dressed, she's 5 feet tall, dressed in lavender hostess pajamas and pink fluffy slippers. Does anyone wear hostess pajamas?
No, when I listened to the tape and you talked about when you started writing the script and talked about the hostess pajamas, I was like, oh, that's a thing? Like, why didn't I know about that thing? That's the best thing.
Yeah.
Lavender hostess pajamas. I'm picturing fluffy mules, am I right? Or no?
Yes, they were.
Okay.
Yeah, but she insisted, with Abby, I had to send her the script, the edited interview and the introduction for approval, and the only thing she cut was the pink fluffy slippers. Abby got tons of hate mail for the things she said when she took a stand for gay people and also other issues that she wrote about. But some of the letters in response to her comments about gay people would remind her to be a good Christian woman, to which she would respond, "Thanks, but I hope I'm a good Jewish person." Now, a sense of humor was an essential tool that activists called on, especially in the years after the Stonewall Uprising. So from one national treasure, Dear Abby, to two people who ought to be national treasures. That is, on the left, Kay Tobin Lahusen, on the right, Barbara Giddings. They are known to some of us anyway as the mothers of the movement. These happy warriors were so inventive in their activism. They had enormous fun fighting for their rights and our rights. They were involved in the movement from Barbara from the 1950s. They met in the early 60s and carried on through the 60s. There's a famous photo of Barbara in a protest march in 1965 in front of the White House. Kay is not in the photo because she was behind the camera. You can see those photos also on the website. So, so they had a lot of fun.
Yeah, they're tapes. So Eric interviewed Barbara and Kay in 1989 over the course of 2 sessions. And so there's about 8 hours worth of interviews. But the thing that's just really wonderful about it for me, sort of listening to it 30 years later, is just the laughter that just comes up over and over again. And also the really, really adorable thing with these two is just the way in which they finish each other's sentences over, which is a challenge when editing audio, but really, really just heartwarming to hear.
Yeah. So I'm going to play a clip. But before I play the clip, I just want to explain why they're holding dinosaurs. They continued to be involved with the movement after Stonewall and went to the first meetings here in New York with the Gay Liberation Front. With a man named Frank Kameny, also featured in one of our episodes, who's one of the most important people in the early movement. And they were called out for being dinosaurs because they were in their 30s. And Kay went out and bought these 2 dinosaurs, which they carried with them to every meeting thereafter. So this clip is from 1971, the American Library Association convention in Dallas. Barbara loved books, and beginning in 1970, created a reading list of all the LGBTQ books that were out there for the American Library Association for their annual convention. The first year, everything fit on one side of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. The second year, in 1971, all the books fit on 2 sides of a legal-sized sheet of paper. But no one was paying attention to their reading list. So they decided that and also no one was going to their booth on the conference floor. So they decided they had to do a little something to get a bit more attention. So they decided to transform their booth. And this is Barbara and Kay talking about how they improvised.
Well, we decided to bypass books and show gay love live. So we called it Hug a Homosexual. And we stripped it down to the bare gray curtains, and we had a sign up, men only at one end and women only at the other. And we stationed ourselves, all four of us, under the signs to give free, mind you, free same-sex kisses and hugs. Well, let me tell you, the aisles were jammed, but nobody came into the booth.
And Life magazine was there.
Life
That was the good
magazine
part.
photographer was there. 2 Dallas television stations had sent camera crews.
Right, but the
And I think
lights
people
were going
rather
on.
intimidated. Yes, the lights were on, and all these people jammed in the aisles, craning their necks to see the action, but nobody wanted to take part. So we did the action. We kissed and embraced each other for 2 hours. We handed out copies of the bibliography. We called out encouragement. We kissed and hugged each other some more. Alma Routzon was an absolute peach. She and I were on the female end, and a couple of the men were on the other, and we did all this ourselves. That really put us
So there
on the
we
map.
were on the 6 o'clock news, and the library
And
people
again-
were livid. They said, we
Nope.
have all these famous authors here, and all they cover is this kissing.
They put us on the 6 o'clock news, they put us again on the 11 o'clock news, and again the next morning. This was news.
The local news.
Yes.
Denver?
Dallas.
Dallas. It was wonderful. And it really, our spirits soared because really the booth also had a message that was useful in any arena, and that is that gay people are not willing anymore to be subject to a special double standard. If we should have the same right to express our affection publicly as heterosexuals have. No more, but no less.
Barbara knew how to smile, and she knew how to wield that smile like a sword. We just spent some time with Kay Lahusen in the retirement community where she lives. Kay is now 88. Barbara died in 2007. Yes, a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah.
When we went to interview Kay last year, she let drop that she hosts a gay table at her retirement community once a month. So what did we have to do?
Yeah, we invited ourselves.
So
If you subscribe to Making Gay History, you'll be hearing that dinner that Eric went to on Thursday. It's a little special extra bonus episode for Pride.
there were 8 of us at the table, and it was an astonishing evening of hearing stories about people's lives. And Kay, even though she's had a stroke, is in a wheelchair, you still don't cross her. She rules the roost and sets an example for other elders about how we should be treated throughout our lives.
Yeah.
So far we've heard some of the big stories, some of the small stories, some of the public history, and some of the personal struggles that were the steps on the path toward LGBTQ plus civil rights. One of the most significant players in the post-Stonewall period is Vito Russo. How many of you have ever heard of Vito Russo? Vito famously wrote a book called The Celluloid Closet. It was published in '81. It's about how gay people were portrayed in the movies. He was a movie archivist and expert, and his theory was that the public's image of gay people is shaped by what they see in the movies. And reading his book, I was stunned by how true that seemed. I found his book on a shelf at Harper & Row when I was a temp there in 1981. I was out, but not so comfortable that I decided to wait until lunch hour when everybody was out of the office to go into the editor's office where I had noticed Vito's book to pull the book off the shelf. And then 7 years later, I was commissioned to write Making History, what became Making Gay History, which I always find striking. So Vito is one of those people who inspired me, but we'll get to that after we listen to his clip. Now, he was one of the first interviews I did for the book in 1988 because it was a race against time. Many of the activists I interviewed were very old, and many of the men had AIDS. And I knew Vito's time was short. Vito was famous for, not just for his book, but also he was one of the co-founders of GLAAD. He was a co-founder of ACT UP. He was also very involved in the Gay Activist Alliance, which was one of the first groups that formed in New York right after the Stonewall uprising. He was already sick at the time I interviewed him, and did not look well when I spoke with him. He had cared for his partner who had died, and he didn't know how long he had. What he knew was that he wanted to survive. He wanted to survive AIDS, in part, as he told me, so he could be around to kick people's asses for failing to deal with the crisis. But he was also thinking about his place in history, and that's the clip we'll play for you, how Vito thought about what he had done and how he might be remembered.
I find it interesting, from what I know about the history of the gay movement, that there always have been and there will always be people who are willing to put their lives on the line for these ideas. Starting from Germany in the turn of the century, in 1895, around, and then into the early teens and 20s, there were a group of people in Germany, headed by Magnus Hirschfeld, who were willing to put their lives on the line. They were willing to make a movie called Different from the Others, which the Nazis seized and burned. That in the 1940s and the 1950s, there were the Harry Hayes and the Barbara Giddings and the Mattachine Society. And then in the 60s, gay liberation. It's the more radical issues that I think are still going to be fought over. Whether gay people have a right to adopt children, get married, teach in the public schools, which they do now, you know, but be open about it.
Right.
And those battles are battles that are going to be fought long after you and I are gone. But you have to make a contribution while you're here. I mean, that's been my whole life, is to leave my book behind. That I know after I'm dead, that book is going to be on a shelf someplace, and what I have to say will reach people. And the things I've written, you know, because it's like, who was the person who said that? Pedro Almodovar. He said, the thing is you can't regret your life, otherwise why did you live? What was the point of having a life if you didn't say something or do something that was going to survive after you're gone? Mm-hmm. And that's the way I feel about it. I mean, I really feel the reason why I'm here is so that I could leave this book and these articles so that some 16-year-old kid who's going to be a gay activist in the next 10 or 15 years is going to read them and carry the ball from there. And that'll happen. Happened with me. Mm-hmm. Harry Hay passed the ball to the Mattachine, and they passed the ball to us.
And you'll pass it on.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think that Vito passed the ball to me in sharing his story with me, and through Making Gay History, it's not a book, but it is an anthology. You don't take it off a shelf, but you put earbuds in and you listen to these stories. And I like to think that Vito will inspire future generations to resist, to fight back, to fight for their rights. And I like to think that by sharing these stories, Sara and I have the opportunity to pass the ball to all of you, to carry it forward.
There's nothing like hearing folks speak for themselves. And now we're at what, 1.7 million downloads.
1.75 million downloads.
Downloaded in 206 nations and territories around the world. We had to add the nations and territory thing, so we were really excited to see the number 206, and we went to do a presentation somewhere, some international nonprofit, and we said, and just as we were about to start it, I was going through my notes, and as we said, 206 countries, and I was like, oops, wait, are there 206 countries? And so yes, 200, as many countries, as many places as countries that compete in the Olympics. Right. That's where we are. Right. So
So Vito is the final clip, and if we'd love to take questions. If you have questions, you just need to step up to the microphone that's on either side of the room and ask your questions. I also have a couple of incredible letters we've had from people, which I would be happy to read if there are no questions, but also very happy to take your questions. Sure.
I have a question about 5, 10, 15 years from now. The way that this type of material is saved today is oftentimes via YouTube, right? Or it's some other sort of social media or technology-enabled platform. And so how is that going to make the job of the next person who has to do this and do Making Gay History like 5.0? How are they going to work with all that material? It's almost like it's too much, but it's good there's so much of it to sort of dissect or to look through? See what I'm saying?
It's a challenge. I generally encourage when I travel and people ask about recording stories of people in their communities, I recommend that they, again, use the best equipment possible and then store their files carefully. But you're right, the platforms keep changing. So when I first donated my archive to the New York Public Library, they were going to transfer all of the cassette tapes to, I think it was 24-karat gold-plated CD-ROM. They took so long in raising the money for the transfer that by the time they did the transfer, it was MP3 files. And MP3 files are no longer used, are they?
It's changing in the protocols,
changing,
I
yes.
think. I mean, you girls will know better than we do. But
Yeah. So the challenge for even the New York Public Library, which is where my archive resides, is to keep updating the platform on which these things are stored. I have absolutely no answers. I do know that we back up everything 3-4 times so that we have multiple places for it. And the podcast itself will be transferred to the New York Public Library for them to store, and they'll have to worry about it. But it is a concern.
But also in terms of the breadth, just the sort of the breadth, the sheer number of stories, I think that's also, so much of this I think is a sort of map analogy, that when Eric set about writing Making History and tried to sort of map out who you were going to speak to, this was a time where, you know, as he said, he couldn't like go to Google or any of those things. So you kind of you went through each issue of The Advocate.
From 1968, every single issue of The Advocate to build a timeline. There were no timelines.
And then trying to find, you know, what was the real name behind the pseudonyms of people. And in fact, someone who we recently interviewed, one of the guests at Kay's Gay Table said that back in those days, there were only 12 people in the movement and the rest was done with mirrors anyway. So I think that one of the great things is the scale and the number of stories to be told now is great. Like if there are that many people from whom you can hear, that is really fantastic. And then it's about finding the piece of the puzzle that is, you know, that speaks to you and telling those stories.
Well, the challenge is there is so much material. No one wants to listen to the 8 hours we have of Barbara Giddings and Kay Lahusen. There are scholars who will want to. But what the podcast offers is something that's digestible. You get a taste. I was talking to a young man on Saturday night who's just graduated from WashU in St. Louis, and he said a friend gave him the book, Making Gay History, and he said, I just don't have the patience to read a whole book, but then I discovered there was a podcast. And so it was like the magic words. Most people don't have the patience to read a 550-page book. I barely had the patience to write one, but I was being paid to do it. But just as an aside about the title of the book, the original title was Making History. And the reason it was called Making History and not Making Gay History the first time around was because the publisher was worried that the sales force would have trouble selling a book with gay in the title and that bookstores would not shelve the book face out if the word gay were in the title. For the second edition, 10 years later, I suggested we put the word gay in the title, and no one objected. So it's called Making Gay History. And that's how we came up with the title of the podcast. Other questions? One more question. Yes, Becca. And then I want to read one letter from one of our listeners.
All right. Yeah, I'm just curious if there's anyone that you wanted to interview that you didn't have a chance to talk with.
Yes, 2 people. I mean, it's just 2. There are so many people I wish I'd had the chance to talk to, but 2 in particular, Bayard Rustin and Leonard Bernstein. Bayard Rustin played an important role. We don't have time to talk about that here, but was not recognized as a gay person at the time he was involved in planning the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington. And Leonard Bernstein, I almost got to interview. Leonard Bernstein was famously closeted. One of my friends worked for him. Initially, he said no, and then she called me very late in my work and said, he's thinking he'll do it. And then 2 weeks later, he died. And he was going to come out in the book, which would have been nice for me, but he didn't. So I just want to read one story of someone who was inspired by the podcast. And I hope that many people are inspired to take action. We've heard from quite a few people who've talked about changing their majors, getting involved in things, because the people whose stories they've heard in the podcast provide a roadmap for how they can change the world. Most of the people who are featured in the podcast changed the world at a time when no one believed it was possible.
And actually, just this opened up a really lovely intergenerational two-way street, because a lot of the emails that we get people will address to Kay Lahusen, because one of her things is whenever Eric calls her, she says to him, "What have you got for me, Eric?"
Yes, the latest news.
And so now people write into Making Gay History with what they've got for Kay.
Yeah, this is not one of them. Hi there, I grew up in what would now be described as an alt-right military family in Texas. Coming out for the first time at 16 was one of the hardest experiences of my life. My father wanted to kick me out, but my mother wanted me to stay and go through conversion therapy. Through a lot of strife and hard work, I was able to get out, and now I am a 25-year-old engineer working in Manhattan. Growing up, I clung to whatever stories of gay history I could learn, just for the sake of remembering that there was more to this community experience than my own. I really related to Morris Kite's sentiment that he never doubted that he was inferior, no matter. He never doubted that he was not inferior, I think is what he meant, no matter how much he was told and treated so. One thing that's really struck me listening to these interviews is how grassroots-based so many of these societies and organizations originally were. It has inspired me to create an organization of my own. I am now working with a small group of other gay engineers from various firms to create a society for gay engineers to meet and for professional education on the experiences of queer people within my industry. It's very early now and just getting started, but hearing about these societies in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with no resources and based out of someone's living room is really motivating me to keep it moving. It makes me feel like we're part of a tradition of queer people, recognizing a deficit in how we're treated in society and just starting where we can and doing whatever we can. Thank you so much for producing this podcast. It warms my soul and reminds me of the continuity of us. Queer people as a community have continually survived the worst and looked out for our own. And as a man without a real family to fall back on, gives me pride in the strength of my chosen family. With peace and blessings and thanks. And that came to us on December 13th, 2017. So thank you so much, Becca Gulata, for arranging today. Thank you, Google. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Sara, for sharing the stage with me.
Thanks, Eric, for everything you did.
Thank you.